Welcome back, econ students. In this video we're going to talk about three main economic questions that all societies have to ask and ultimately answer, and then depending upon how those questions are answered are going to determine what we call an economic system. And an economic system is going to be basically how a country goes about making stuff and distributing that stuff. So it pays to start with those three basic economic questions. And three basic economic questions are really easy. So the first one is what a country is going to produce, right? So what to produce. So that means like we want to produce cars. We want to produce grain. We want to produce some sort of military equipment, right? So what are we going to make? How much of it are we going to make? Who's going to make it? All of these go under the what a country is going to make. That doesn't, I mean, it could happen spontaneously, or a country could determine we want this amount of cars, we want that amount of grain, and we want this amount of military equipment. So the what question is determining what kind of stuff are we going to end up with. The second question that all groups of people need to answer is how are we going to make those things, right? So we have, it's been determined, whatever way you answer that question of what to produce, you need to now know how are we going to make it. Are we going to make it with lots of technology? Are we going to be dependent upon human labor? Are we going to use alternative sources of energy? Are we going to use coal? Like, how are we going to go about getting the materials to produce these things? Right? The third one is the more controversial one, but besides what to produce, how to produce it, we want to know who's going to get it, or we could say for whom. Right? Who gets these cars that are made? Who gets this grain that's made? Who gets this military stuff that is made? So for whom do we produce? Or who determines who gets it? Right? Who gets to determine who's going to get it? And so really, if you think of it like you're going to make a pie, right? So this is going to be our economic pie. And the what question is the type of pie that you make, right? What type of pie are you going to make? The how is how are you going to end up baking it? How are you going to put it together? How are you going to cook it, right? So how's it going to get done? And then for whom is basically how do you slice it up? And who gets to determine how you slice it up? And then who gets certain amounts of pieces of that pie? Right? So this is going to be our economic pie. And the economic system is going to answer those questions in different ways. So we're going to take a look at four different kind of distinct ways that the what, the how, and the for whom are answered. All right. So the first one is a simple one. It's not used. I shouldn't say used. It's not as common probably as the other ones, but we'll at least mention it. And the first one is a traditional economy. All right. Traditional economies, they're not very innovative, they're not very inventive, and the what question, the what to produce, is determined by how they've always done stuff, right? So it's determined by tradition, right? So what are we going to make? We are going to make maybe agricultural goods. A lot of traditional economies are ag-based. So they're always going to make agricultural goods. They're always going to produce certain grains, or they're always going to produce certain meats from animals. They're always going to do that because that's the way they've always done that. And there's a little innovation, so they kind of stick with this ag-based economy. How are we going to produce these agricultural goods? Well, a lot of times, since they're not focused on innovation or invention, they do those things with a lot of human labor. Right? So it's a lot of human labor to do these things because that's the way that they've always done things. That's the tradition. Right? And then for whom is determined by tradition. So if that were to be based upon maybe a certain class or a certain level within society, a certain job gets certain amounts of goods, that's how tradition has done it. That's how they're going to answer that question, is how they've always done it. Right? So the what, the how, and the for whom are all determined by tradition. And a lot of times they're much more agricultural based, human capital based. A lot of less times they're underdeveloped countries because there's little innovation, there's little motivation for invention or expansion. So that's a traditional economy. So I'm going to move that one off to the side. Okay. Now the next two are two key ones that determine basically all economic systems. And so we'll kind of split this and we'll see a command over here, and then what we call a market economy over here. Now these two are direct opposites of each other, right? So if a command does it one way, market does it opposite way. So remember the three questions are what, how, and who gets it. And so how do you think a command economy answers the what, the how, and the who, right? So a command economy answers it by basically the government determines it, or what we'll call central planners. And these central planners are basically economic people that are determining what a country should have, or what a country's people need. And so central planners are actually sitting down and they are thinking about these things, and they then have an idea that they're going to make X amount of cars and X amount of houses and X amount of grain, and basically these economic planners determine what a country needs. The free market is the opposite of that, right? It's not central planners, it's people. I know that might not seem like an opposite, but central planners is a group of, let's say, a group of, 8 or 1,000 people, or it's a group that sits down to determine it for everybody else. This is the everybody else, right? So there's no group that determines it for everybody else. It's everybody else that determines it for everybody else. It's basically individual people that are determining what they want. How do they make that known? They go and they buy it. As they buy it, they're basically voting for certain types of goods that they want to be produced. So what is made is determined by the people. What is made over here is determined by a group, small group of people that determines what's best for everybody else. Well, how do they go about making it? Right? Well, they go about making it based upon what people desire to have it made in. Right? So the people over here, the market determines how things are generated. Over here, it's determined by the government. And so a good example of a command or a centrally planned economy, actually let me write that down so we have that one. I'll move this one up a little ways. Good example of a centrally planned economy, centrally planned, is the Soviet Union, the SU, Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, they decided, well, how are we going to go about making, like, let's say, agricultural goods? Well, we're going to take everybody's land away from them, right? So we're going to collect everybody's land, basically steal it from them, and we're going to dictate that this group of people produce this amount of, let's say, grain. And that's the how it was made, was determined. The government said, this land now is owned by the government, and this group of people is now going to farm that land. Right, but that's not what happens in a free market. What happens in a free market is people that want to produce grain. They're motivated by profit in order to produce that grain, or they're motivated by their skill to produce something that people want. That's not so over here, right? So the last question is the for whom question. So for whom, well, that over here, it's basically determined by what you put in, right? So if I put in, I don't want to make up a number, but if I put in X amount of work, I get out X amount of goods, right? So if I put in work, I get out work. Or if I put in goods, I get out goods. If I put in work, I get more stuff out, right? Over here in the command economy, it's not based upon that. So I might put in X, but only get out a fraction of that, right? It depends upon what the government determines I need. And that's who gets to determine what I get. And it's not what I put in. It's not how much I work. It's what the government determines is good for me. All right? So these two economic systems. So we've got now, if we go back up here, we've got traditional economy determining the what, the how, and the for whom. All right? We had a command economy. It's the government and central planners determining the what, the how, and the for whom. And then over here, basically all individual people determining based upon their own preferences the what, the how, and the for whom. All right, so we'll put those off to the side, and we'll look at our last economic system. And our last economic system is the economic system that is the economic system within all societies, and that is a mixed economic system. So that's kind of a catch-all, right? So if we have this kind of continuum, and on one side we have dominated by centrally planned economies or command economies like that, and on the other side we have free market economies, which would be these like that. Basically all economic systems fall somewhere in between those two extremes, right? So the United States is more free market based, but it's not completely free market. The government dictates and determines certain things. It regulates certain things. So the U.S. typically kind of falls on this side of that continuum, on the more free market side. It's not the most free market actually, but it's fairly free market. North Korea would be on the opposite side, not completely centrally planned, but almost. There is still some free market that takes place, although most of the time it's illegal. China was over here and has been moving this way. Actually, one of the most free market economies in the world today is Hong Kong, is way over here. And we'll talk about why Hong Kong is unique in class. All right, so these are the four different types of economic systems. Basically what you have is traditional economies, which are more or less underdeveloped, agriculturally based. You have command, where the government is dictating things. You have free market, which is determined by individual people determining their own self-interest. And then you have almost all economies today, which are falling in between those two extremes of centrally planned and free market. That's basically the different types of economic systems that you can find in the world today based upon how they answer the what, the how, and the for whom questions.